Hello everyone, this is Jerry Volesky, Range and Forage Specialist with the University of Nebraska at the West Central Research and Extension Center. And today I was going to talk a little bit about our grazing and pasture management during and after drought. And what I'd first like to cover is a little bit of what the effect of drought is on our pasture grasses, as well as some of the things we might do here in the 2013 growing season to help mitigate some of the effects of drought. To start, I'd just like to do a little quick review of last year, 2012. I've got a slide here with some points for Central Nebraska. First of all, of course, we had that well above average spring temperatures, a very rapid accumulation of growing degree days. In Central Nebraska, most of the area had March is relatively dry, but near average precip in April. Now in western Nebraska, of course, they were pretty much dry all the way through that early spring period. Both the cool and warm season growth, of course, was much below average. I estimate anywhere from 50, 60, 70% for the cool seasons and maybe roughly 40 to 50% of average for the warm seasons. And of course, as we got into the first part of May, things really dried out pretty much statewide and maintain that way the rest of the season. Just some precipitation data from here, a site in southern Brown County. It's our UNL Barta Brothers Research Ranch in the Sandhills. And a way I like to look at precipitation is going back over the previous dormant season, so the October of 2011 through March of 2012. And as you can see, we were very close to the long-term average for that wintertime period. April at this location was actually a little bit above average, and then the critical months of May, June, and July well below average. At this location in August, we did pick up a little bit of rain in early August, but as far as our pastures and rangelands are concerned, August is a little bit too late in terms of having much impact or resulting in response of grass growth. One thing that's common, I think, across the state last year was that the carryover or residual grass that we had from 2011 really allowed producers to maintain, I would call them, fair stocking rates. In other words, cattle had to consume a lot of that the previous year's growth. Now with that, we will not have much carryover grass as we go into 2013. Obviously, most pastures were grazed fairly heavily last year because of the drought, and so that residual or carryover grass is for the most part gone. Now, overall, we do have a good set of data from this one location here with the longer-term grass or herbage production from an upland Sandhills range site, and you do see considerable year-to-year variation in the amount of grass produced. Now, one of the things that, in terms of precipitation, that has the best relationship with our pasture production is the May, June, and July precipitation, okay? And for the most part, that's probably the first half of July that really has the impact. When you put the pasture or herbage production graph beside or side by side with a precip for those that 3-month period, you do see a fairly good relationship or correlation. Now, of course, if you're dealing with a predominantly cool season grass pasture, that's going to change. In that case, the April and May precipitation is much more important, and that's where the greatest relationship or correlation would be. Now, overall, I think a lot of people are a little bit concerned about what was the effect of that drought last year on those grasses, and you do have to keep in mind that these native and even many of the introduced seeded pasture grasses are quite resilient to drought. They've experienced drought before. Most of these grasses are perennials, and they can and will recover or bounce back. Obviously, we have conditions with drought of much less above ground growth, but also the root growth is very important. it's a common principle or concept we like to talk about, that with our grass plants, they have just as much below ground or root growth as they do above ground growth each year during their growing season or growing cycle. Other things, of course, depending on the severity of drought, we'll have much fewer of our grass plants producing seed heads, and certainly that was the case last year. Not very many of them all had enough moisture to produce seed heads. Depending on the severity of the drought, we'll have an early maturity of plants, and that does have implications related to the nutrition of those grasses. And one thing we definitely had last year, I think, in a lot of areas with severe drought was plant dormancy. For the most part, those grasses just flat out ran out of water. If we're thinking about the warm season grasses, for example, in the Sandhills, what I observed was that typically by the end of June and early July, they had gotten to the point where they were rapidly going into drought-induced dormancy. One other important effect of drought on our grass plants is how it does, or how it affects reproduction. And this is where I'll talk a little bit more about this, about how it affects the rhizomes and the development of buds, and then also the energy or carbohydrate reserves of our grass plants. Also, something that's very common during a drought, or the second year after a drought, or with continuing drought, is a lot of times we'll have big increases in weedy species in our pastures. Many times these are just annual weeds that typically we probably haven't seen them much before, but they're just very opportunistic, and they do show up with these droughts. One of the things about them, though, they do take away some soil moisture, and many are not very palatable in terms of the grazing. I mentioned reproduction before, and it's also another important concept with grasses, that perennial grasses, is that the majority of the reproduction is vegetative. And I have an example here of a prairie sandreed, a warm season sandhills grass, and these grasses have underground rhizomes or root structures, and from these rhizomes there are buds that develop, and then from these buds new tillers or new shoots of grass will arise each year. Now sometimes these tillers emerge from the soil later in the growing season, but at the start of each new growing season is when you have the highest numbers of these buds developing into tillers and emerging. And in the case of the drought that we had last year, we're expecting that this bud development in 2012 would have been much less than normal. Another important factor we have to consider is our soil moisture conditions. Now, across the state, the soil moisture levels are very low no matter which area you are in. I have a graph here showing 2012 and 2011, and this is representing the top 3 feet or 36-inch soil moisture content. And if you're following the red line, you can see at the beginning of the season in April, we were fairly high. The up and down fluctuations there are just a response to some rain events. And as May rolled around, we saw this rapid depletion of soil moisture through the summer. This location got a little bit of rain in August, but it didn't last long. And the concerning part is here where we ended the season last fall in terms of soil moisture status. Here in a sandy type of soil, such as the Sandhill site, 3 to 4.5 inches can fairly quickly replenish this level of soil moisture. In heavier soils, your loam soils, that's definitely going to take a lot more. And of course, obviously, this moisture that's needed to replenish the soil moisture would ideally come in slower type of rainfall events, particularly on that heavy ground. And again, this is just the top 3 feet of soil. If we were to go to depths below that, I'm fairly certain that those are quite dry as well. I also mentioned carbohydrate reserve status, and in a normal growing season, our perennial grasses, they'll start the growing season hopefully at a relatively high level, and they use energy or carbohydrate reserves for their initial growth until they get up to that maybe 4 or 5 leaf stage. And once they reach that, they're able to both continue growth for the rest of the season as well as replenish those reserves of carbohydrates. And so then ideally end the season at relatively high levels again and be ready to go for the subsequent year. Now I think what happened last year might look something like this. Started off the season okay, got the mid-June in the case of a warm season grass. They were running out of moisture, began going into the drought dormancy, and then pretty much flatline in terms of where they were able to, or how much additional carbohydrate reserves they were able to accumulate over the rest of the season. And so ending last year at these low levels is a little bit troublesome or worrisome in terms of thinking about how they're going to be able to start off here in 2013. So drought is definitely a stress on our grasses, of course, and then also grazing. We do know it has an impact on them, and when you put the two together, we do know that certainly that can be problematic in terms of the subsequent health and production of those grasses. A common principle we like to talk about in our grazing management relates to rapid growth periods of our perennial grasses. In the case of warm season grasses here, and maybe specifically pick out prairie sandreed, that's the time when it transitions from a vegetative growth stage and begins much more rapid growth. Many of the individual tillers or stems will elongate and ultimately or eventually produce a seed head. And from our past work in grazing, we do know that grazing during this rapid growth phase is the most stressful time on the grasses, particularly when it's done 2, 3, 4 years in a row. A cool season grass, of course, would have a rapid growth phase earlier in the season. And so with that, we generally talk about how important it is to alternate or vary the timing of grazing in different pastures from year to year. In other words, not graze the same pasture at the same time each year. Another important point is the grazing impact on dormant grasses is minimal. Here, in terms of the winter time or dormant season, any grazing that takes place is, for the most part, very uneventful for a grass plant. The above ground growth is dormant. Now, of course, there are exceptions. If we were really beating that dormant grass into the ground, then of course it would have some effect on us. But in the case of drought, of course, like we saw later last summer when those grasses were in a drought induced dormancy, I think the impact on them would have been much less. So in other words, later, mid and late summer of last year. But last year, I think most of our, in this case, warm season grasses did have some green vegetative growth during late May through early part of July. And so I'm suggesting here that pastures grazed at that time last year, they should receive deferment priority in 2013. Well, what do we expect in 2013? I've got 3 possible precipitation scenarios here. One of them is going to be right, not sure which one. The second one here, according to a lot of the climatologists that I've heard from or listened to here over the last couple of months, they are suggesting that we will probably be dry. Probably not as bad as last year, as number 3, but still relatively dry or some level of drought. So that is concerning. Now, some of the things I think we can do yet here this winter and spring is look back at what we did in terms of our 2012 grazing records. Look at the timing of grazing, the stocking rate used, and some of the individual pastures you might manage. and also how much residual or carryover herbage or forage was left, if any. It's all going to come down to just really balancing that forage supply that is produced and the demand or the number of livestock that you're trying to graze. Another common principle in range management about recommendations after a drought or even during continued drought, this first one here is delay initial turnout. And for a lot of people, that's something that's obviously very difficult to do. We are going to be getting some precipitation this spring. Those pasture grasses will start to green up. And of course, we've been feeding hay throughout the spring and probably very anxious to get out there on those pastures. But by delaying turnout, and I'm talking just maybe even as little as 2 weeks can help. 3 would maybe be better, 4 better yet. But what that does, it does allow those grasses to begin that initial growth, accumulate a few more leaves in terms of their growth stage, use what soil moisture there might be available, and bottom line to give them a little extra time to begin that recovery period or that recovery process. Secondly, reduction in stocking rates. I'll talk a little bit more about that. I think because of the impact of last year's drought and anticipating some reduction in stocking rate is going to be important. Now, a little bit about planning for the coming year or planning overall in terms of drought. I've been involved in a program called Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch, and part of that is developing a written drought plan for your ranch and pastures. And really the idea with planning and the written plan is to be ahead of the game. In any event, if we're moving from point A to point B, in this case I'm using the analogy of a nice expected normal pasture conditions to drought, the earlier we can do that, we have much more time in our wedge. And the later we are delaying or going then into that event or to the point where that event starts, the level of stress goes up considerably higher. And in just visiting with people that do have written drought plans in place, one of the things that they really like in terms of what they did last year in 2012, it just made it that much less stressful. One other component of a plan, and there are several, but that I just wanted to talk a little bit about, is critical dates. And really, with this concept, it's really all about monitoring precipitation amounts by certain critical dates, and of course, with that, what type of forage growth will we expect? And with that, if the precipitation amounts aren't there, those deficits trigger some type of management action. Of course, we also do need, well, I should say, it's again based on that grass production precipitation relationship that we know is really the driving force. But of course, you do need to consider these points here, such as the previous soil moisture, or excuse me, previous year conditions, the soil moisture status, temperatures, whether it be warm or cold. Last year, 2012, we had that very early spring, of course, carryover grass. And then I even like to include longer-term weather forecasts. These are getting, considerably more reliable, and they certainly, I think, do have a place in terms of helping us plan for what we might expect 1 or 2 or even 3 months down the road. Here's just an example of using some critical dates. Again, it is an example, and I think these dates or time periods are really relevant for most areas in Nebraska. So in this column, we have those dates or periods. In the middle column, we have what I'm saying is a stocking rate impact. You could also use grass production. And then in the third column would be the management action. What has to take place as a result of the different varying conditions. So, first of all, we might look at the previous growing season, okay? In this case, it would be 2012. Would have a choice of Average, in that case, if it were average, none would be the impact, so nothing else would need to be done. But in the case of severe drought, such as we had last year, I'm estimating that we should probably have a 15 to 20% reduction in our stocking rate just because of the 2012 drought. And then, of course, some management actions would have had to take place. And again, keep in mind, these would have occurred last fall, okay? Now, another important date, April 1st, the end of the dormant season. Let's look at where we were with what happened over the winter months. Average, of course, again, that choice, none. Some level of drought here, I'm just saying, roughly 70%. That, again, then would suggest another reduction in stocking rate or an anticipated reduction in grass growth. And then with that, again, following into some more management actions. Of course, these are cumulative. They do add up. There are many different possibilities in terms of management actions that a ranch could choose from, and that's another part of the plan. Put down a list of these management actions that you could use in order to meet the deficit that you're anticipating. The previous slide I just showed was for a one type of scenario. This example here shows different scenarios in terms of precipitation. So here on the left side, I've got the date or period, the impact related to stocking rate that's anticipated, and then here, different choices of what management actions a producer might use. So the case here, the date here is June 1st that I'm using, again, as an example. But if our average precipitation during the previous couple of months is about 6.2 inches, and I'm using, maybe plus or minus 20%, that'd be close enough to normal or average, no impacts or actions required, but then different levels of dryness during that previous 2-month period, and or at least estimated reductions in stocking rate or grass productions that we would have. And then, of course, select from your portfolio of management actions that might balance out the anticipated reductions. Of course, these individual drought plans, especially using with these critical dates, is it's an adaptive process, I think. You have to modify each year and learn from your experience. There is some data out there that can help you set some of those dates and precipitation records and those types of things. The other thing that's very important too, I think, is every drought is somewhat different. We know it's dry during a drought, but in terms of the interaction with our grassland or range plant communities, there can be subtle differences between drought in terms of when it starts, certain timing of individual rainfall events can really make a big difference. So it's not a perfect science by any means. Another just important point I think to bring out is we've had the 1 year of drought, but if we go into a second year of drought, our grazing management is going to be very important. We need to be at the top of our game with that because of multiple year drought and a little bit improper in terms of our grazing management can really affect the long-term health and productivity of our pastures. There's much more additional information available from our droughresources.unl.edu website or the beef.unl.edu website. And for those that are interested in learning more about some of the planning aspects, check out this website here, drought.unl.edu/ranchplan. Has the complete publication on planning, and then also a number of other online resources that are available that you can look through and read, as well as a number of other recorded webinars. With that, that will wrap up things, and I would invite you, if you have any additional questions, you could feel free to contact me either by telephone or the email address here listed on your screen. Thank you, and have a good day.